Hello, this is Malcolm and Simone here with a guest, David Lorentzon, who's a demographer from Sweden. And he's coming to us with some interesting theories he pulled up a lot of data on to just give like a brief summary of what we're going to be getting into on this episode. We're going to look at how the incel crisis in Europe and potentially the United States drove mass female immigration into the Western world. We're going to look at crashing birth rates in the second generation of immigrants in Northern Europe. And we're going to be looking at other surprising demographic facts that could be driven by current trends.
Thank you. I appreciate that. The research, when I got into it, I was originally researching mass immigration from the Muslim world. And what Sweden does really well is that it has detailed data from every country, and it also lets you divide it based on gender and age. So what I realized when I looked at the total numbers was that it was very gender balanced migration into Sweden. But what you saw in the media was overwhelmingly male migration from the Middle East and Africa. So there was a very big discrepancy between the portrayal in the media and what the data was showing. And I later discovered the answer when I started looking through each country individually and saw that some countries you receive a lot of male immigration from, and some you receive a lot of female migration from. And the female migration was so vast that it resulted in the total migration being gender balanced.
Wow. So where are we seeing female immigration from?
So to visualize the data in a simplified manner, this is the immigration to Sweden.
Okay.
And the red is where it's majority female from. And the blue is majority male from. And all the beige, there's a few beige countries. That's where it's so gender balanced.
Wow.
And what you can see is that you can generalize entire regions of the world. So as you expect, you can see that Northern Africa, the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent is overwhelmingly male. You can also see that Western Europe, you receive majority male migrants from. And then you receive from Eastern Europe, majority female, East Asia, Southeast Asia, the southern half of Africa, and also in general, Latin America. That's where you receive mass immigration of women from. And it's primarily marriage migration.
Because okay. Yes, okay.
That makes a lot of sense.
That explains so much. I was like, why?
So let's talk about like a thesis for how this would happen.
No one wants to marry American women in Sweden.
Well, no, it's
but when you look at women in Sweden, I'm so sorry, America.
No, but look at what these countries
I have a Californian mom, so
what you see in these countries is that these are the most anti-woke and conservative countries with people who pass as white. Specifically, we're looking
at major arbitrage.
So within some of the woker countries like Sweden, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw this in other European countries, where the native women are removing themselves from the marriage market, which is what we've seen with the rise of inceldom, and we've talked a lot about the dynamics of this. One of the core things that happens is women begin to value their marriage marketplace value as equivalent to their sexual marketplace value, which causes them to highly misjudge the quality of guy they can get and not enter the serious marriage market until, and they also don't realize how quickly their value degrades after 30. So and no, I'm not talking about this in like an objective, like I'm putting a price on women or something like that. What I'm talking about here is in the way that everything has a value to someone else. What I pay for a fish might be different from what somebody else pays for a fish, but it has an average value. And if you misjudge your value, or I misjudge like what this house will sell for, and I put it on the market at a stupidly high price, nobody's going to buy it. Especially if I get all full of myself and I say, I won't on principle sell it for less than this price. I'm definitely going to get no one to buy it. But women in Latin America, in Russia, in Ukraine aren't going to feel that way. Continue.
Right. So there are some serious, the reason that there's so many such large levels of marriage migration coming into Sweden is because of imbalances in the dating market. There is a lot of men who are incels, and instead of being idle and giving up, they are traveling abroad. They are going on dating online services. And the largest countries when it comes to marriage migration is Southeast Asia, like Thailand, Brazil, or like Russia. And you notice that these are countries that are relatively stable, middle income, not the third world necessarily. And it also tends to be popular tourist destinations such as Thailand. Like 80% of all immigration Sweden gets from Thailand is women.
Fascinating. Well, Thailand's also known as a passport bro country. That's the other category of countries I'm
Well,
seeing
part
here
of
is passport bro countries.
if I were a leader in this country, what would I create old-fashioned feminine finishing schools? Should try to get remittances out of this? Like where it's such a weird thing, but like can this be beneficial to the
I
country
assume
sending
there's
women out?
remittances
Because I'm
coming out of this.
assuming no, I mean my primary concern would be that this is damaging to the countries because it's causing a gender imbalance, which is going to exacerbate their own demographic collapse issues, unless they are in turn importing women from some other place. So I would really worry about that. But if there's some way to make it a remittances gain, you could maybe make up for that. I don't know.
So marriage migration overwhelmingly benefits Western countries when it comes to boosting their birth rates. The women don't tend to do a lot of crime, and they tend to assimilate very well because you have a person inside the household who is actively working all the time with integrating that woman.
Right. Yeah.
So it's not even the government that is doing the integration. The reason that the integration works is because there is a man inside the house taking his personal time to integrate an individual. So this marriage migration, very little of it is happening in countries like India and China. And it tends to be these middle income countries like Brazil, Thailand, Russia that are on the losing end of this trade, that they are losing women, and it's a net negative for them, but it's in general a net positive for the Western countries. And it is having some serious demographic transformations in Europe and in the US as well. So I did not only research Sweden for the Institute of World Politics, I researched 4 countries. So the next country.
Well, it makes a lot of sense with the concept of what passport bros are looking for. And I think what we're seeing in this data is that passport bros are having a bigger impact on immigration trends and replacing the white Western woman is being replaced. Like they have opted out of the genetic marketplace.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and being quite mindfully. It's not as though like they're being passed up, oh, I'm so sad. All the men are rejecting me. They're choosing to live alone. It's not like these men are,
what happens, so you have the marriage migration is largely fueled by a massive surplus of men. So there are 4 factors that are leading to these that there are way more men who are single. Yeah, and also in these other countries as well. So there's 4 factors that I really broke it down to.
Okay.
And it's not just in Sweden.
There are more men in Sweden than women, you're saying?
Way more.
Well, of course. Continue.
So if you were to just look at everyone between age 0 and 65 and exclude all of those pensioners, then you see that there is about 220,000 more men than women in Sweden, and it becomes even more extreme in their 20s and early 30s. And
okay, because I'm looking at aggregate, and there's only a slight.
Yeah, but when you exclude all of the people above 65, you see there's
Oh, because the survivorship problem. So
exactly.
Okay, yeah. So if there's a little bit of a deficit in women,
so what's the difference? If you exclude everyone above 65, what's the percent men, women?
So there's about 4%, 5% more men than women, and that means that there's about 220,000 of them more.
What created that?
Naturally, more boys are born than women every single year. It's not 50-50. It's around 51.5% of all births are boys, 48.5% of all births are women.
So my guess would be, that doesn't explain it.
You think it's a genetic thing?
I think it has to do
it's a genetic thing that male sperm swim faster.
No. This is true, but this wouldn't explain this difference. It wouldn't explain a 4
it's one of 4 factors.
Okay, what are the other?
The other factor is that you have a gender-segregated economy, that women prefer to do jobs that has to do with other people. And that tends to be concentrated in the cities.
Okay.
And men tends to prefer job that has to do with things such as construction, farming, engineering. And that is usually what the job market in the countryside looks like. So when you look at where the marriage migration is going to, it's overwhelmingly to the countryside. That's the biggest form of immigration, to the countryside.
Right,
It's
but
bigger
that
than
doesn't have
labor.
any impact on the overall male-female demographics of Sweden.
It's so numerous that it is having an effect.
No, but I mean,
And
it mathematically can't unless they're leaving the country. Are you saying they're leaving the country for other cities?
yeah, a lot of women are leaving the countryside to move to the cities.
But the
And
cities are still in Sweden.
yes,
Well, so then it wouldn't affect the 4 to 5% difference. So what are the other factors?
the other factors, oh yeah, that specific factor has to do with men just not dying, you know?
Oh, at the rate
Usually
they did
men,
historically, yeah.
yeah, historically men tended to die because of the occupation or because of war or something else, that they just lived shorter lives. But since we've had peace for so long, for almost a century, you have a male surplus. It's
Wouldn't it
very small
would
every year, but it
it couldn't
accumulates over generations.
it couldn't increase the initial 1% surplus. What's the next thesis?
The next thesis is the political divide, so that men are overwhelmingly center right, women are overwhelmingly center left, and since Christianity is now taking a back seat in terms of priority for marriage, what's take precedence is political values. And it's become very hard for right-wing men to find right-wing women to pair bond with, and vice versa for left-wing women to pair bond with left-wing men.
Yeah, I agree with this, but this is only going to create a functional problem in the dating market, not make women disappear from the country. So here's my thesis.
So
Because
the
none
women
of
are
these
not
explain.
disappearing. It's just because of these imbalances with finding difficulties in finding a partner, you're then
I
it's causing
agree,
women.
but we're dealing with a separate mystery here. The separate mystery is Sweden has a 4 to 5% additional male population.
Yeah.
Men are born at 1% more than women. You would need something causing women to
2%.
leave the country. You would need either them moving to cities outside the country, which it doesn't appear is happening. You would need, so here is my guess of what's causing the imbalance. What's causing the imbalance is a mirage caused by changing immigration patterns. I would guess in the last generation of immigration, it was mostly workers from these like Middle Eastern countries and stuff. And that bolstered the male population because we already know that they were disproportionately male. And so the functional problem we have right now is not literally there aren't enough women. It's that nobody who is a male in one of these countries wants to marry one of these women who are in this country due to political reasons, due to failures of the dating market, as I was talking about earlier, which is actually a more interesting problem, I think. And that it also would imply that this trend of passport bros actually in mass, enough to affect statistics, enough to cancel out all like Muslim immigration is exploded very, very recently. And I would believe that given what I have seen in our own social circles. In the right-wing influencer space in the US, like a ton of the men have girlfriends and wives that they got from Latin America.
Yes. So in the US, I tried to find immigration divided by country and then divided by sex, gender.
Okay.
And I could not find it in the US, unfortunately. But what I think is happening in the US is that you're basically receiving the illegal immigration, the labor immigration, and the mass marriage migration all from the same countries, which is Latin American countries. In Europe, it's more easily traceable because it's all so categorically from different countries. Yeah. So from Thailand, you basically don't receive any labor or any illegal immigration. So when it says 80% women, it's obviously due to marriage, due to tourism to those countries. They met someone and then they brought them back home. And when it comes to Russia, yeah, you receive a little bit of labor from there, but it's when it says 67% women, you can conclude that, yeah, a lot of it has to do with dating services and marriage migration as a result.
Yeah.
So in the US, you do have a large scale of marriage migration. It's just that it's a lot harder to trace because it's all coming from the same countries. All these different kinds are coming from Latin America, basically, and a couple of other major countries.
Yeah, let's look at the next map you got here.
So this is the map of the US in the year 2000. And you can see that in the Midwest, there's a lot more blue, which makes sense. It's more rural. It's less
What is
populated.
blue?
Men
Men is blue.
Look at Alaska. I mean, come on, Malcolm, guess.
Oh yeah, all right.
Alaska,
Yeah.
the matriarchy.
Well, I wasn't sure about the immigration map.
And you
All
can
right.
look at Nevada, it's completely blue. That means it's overwhelmingly male. And that makes sense
Huh,
because
yeah,
these are less densely populated areas
yeah.
that have more agriculture, more
But why
resource
Maine? Why is
extraction.
Maine so female? Why
Right.
is Miami so female? And like extra female. That is
But that's because they are major urban areas where there's a lot of services.
oh, but not Maine. Not Maine.
Yeah,
Maine's
Maine is
like the
good.
liberals, Alaska.
But also you have New Hampshire, so it might be like
Um,
more libertarian areas or more female.
I guess.
Also, Maine and New Hampshire are both known as being very scenic, and I noticed.
the lesbians' paradise.
Yes. Anyway,
Okay.
continue
Okay.
with the point you're making.
Oh,
Now we
oh,
go
look,
20 years forward.
Okay. Okay.
Now the gender balance is almost exactly the same. So the gender ratio almost exactly the same, but you can
Okay.
see here that the amount of blue increased by a lot.
California is losing ground.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And what's happened here is we have created a gender segregated economy.
Look at that. Wow.
So women prefer to do jobs that are different from men, and men prefer to do jobs that are different from women. As a result, their migratory patterns are different. Men, to a much greater extent, work and live in the countryside because that's where good jobs for men are.
Sure.
Such as agriculture, construction, oil industry, resource extraction, etc.
Mhm.
And in the cities, you have jobs that has to do with people.
Mhm.
You have healthcare, you have public services, you have education, and
Well, you
et
could
cetera.
argue that women are more dependent on social safety nets, both of the government and of families. So they're more likely to, if they have children, or even if they just want to feel safer, live closer to parents.
This goes into
or-
the psychology, yes.
Yeah.
So women prefer to have a job that is safe to do while being pregnant.
Yeah. Well, or if you have kids, you're going to want to be in an area that has daycare that's not like 2 hours away that the state pays for. So that makes sense.
Exactly. A night shift in a mine, not very safe or appealing for pregnant women. So
I mean, depending on your style. Sure.
yeah, but let's say a coal mine, right?
Yeah.
But so what you're pointing out here is that this is creating pressure for men to import women.
Yes.
That's the point of this.
Yes. So the research in Sweden show that, for example, there was a paper called Thai Immigrants in Sweden, Victims or Participants, and it concluded that it was overwhelmingly to the countryside that they were going to. And there was a paper that Kaiserbauch shared with me on Discord
Nice.
when he was researching South Korea that showed that 30% of South Korean farmers had a foreign wife.
Wow, 30%. So for
30%.
people who are watching this and are like, this phenomenon of passport bros actually marrying mail order brides or whatever you want to call them, is it that large? I would ask yourself, do you live near an urban area? Because if you do, then you are not in one of the regions that is experiencing this, and you may not be aware of the scale of what is happening.
Yeah. So I would not have discovered marriage migration if I lived in the US. You know, my parents, one is American, one is Swedish. They were debating whether for me to grow up in California or in Sweden. If I grew up in the US, I would never have discovered this because of the quality of the data. And also because by living in the countryside in Sweden, where there's such a massive male abundance, you notice it in firsthand. So,
well, I notice it in right-wing culture in the US. And this is something that progressives just refuse to see. But in right-wing culture in the US, there is a large portion of right-wing men with either East Asian or Latin American wives. One of the ones I think of, like just off the top of my head, person who's always accused, even though there's like no evidence of this, Johnny Anomaly. I don't know if you know his work. It's Johnny Anomaly must be racist or something. And he's married to a Brazilian, right? Or the Colombian.
Colombian, I think she's Colombian.
Yeah. There's so many you can name. You know, when you start thinking about marriage migration and then just count the number of people who have contributed to it on the right wing, it's a long list, including Donald Trump, Slovenian wife.
I know.
Exactly,
I know.
Donald
Yeah.
Trump. Yeah, and from one of these countries. But it is disproportionately going to be on the right wing as well. Like if you're
Yes.
like, I don't see this, or most of your friends right wing. And the reason is because there is 2 right-wing men for every 1 right-wing woman, and for every 1 left-wing man, there are 2 left-leaning women, which is why a lot of guys fake being left for strange. Because
Yeah. Well, also because left-leaning women are really unwilling to even cross the aisle, which
Right.
yes,
doesn't
so
help.
left-leaning women are less likely to date across the aisle than right-leaning men are in the statistics.
Yes. So due to all of these different factors like gender segregated economy, the political divide also dividing gender, and that there's a slightly male surplus now because we haven't had a mass male killing event in a long time, and etc.
Do you have any more maps?
For example, let's go to Germany.
Okay.
So
Germany.
Sweden had data on every single country publicly available. These other European countries did not. They usually only had like the top 40 or the top 50. Fortunately, with Germany, it also presented the continental data. So that's why it's kind of like striped to the side. That's when I use the continental data.
Yeah.
And here you can see that basically the same picture, that Africa, the Middle East, Indian subcontinent, overwhelmingly male, Eastern Europe, overwhelmingly female, Latin America, overwhelmingly female, and also Southeast Asia is overwhelmingly female as well.
And one thing I've noticed for this, which is really bad for the host country, someone you're asking like, when does this hurt? How could China, which already has a female shortage, in every one of these has been a net contributor of women, which is going to magnify the problem of a lot of men in China not being able to find spouses.
Yeah. And when you're constantly losing so many women, then a fertility rate of 2.1 will not be sufficient.
Yeah.
If you're constantly losing women, you're probably going to need a fertility rate of 2.2 or 2.3 to just have a stable population. And I calculated that in Sweden, the number of women we're getting is so vast that we don't need a fertility rate of 2.1 to have a stable population. In fact, it would be growing at a considerable rate at that point. The stable fertility rate would be at 1.9.
1.9. Wow, that's a shocking amount of immigration.
Now, and all you need is somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 women on net immigrating into the country each year. That's it.
One of the things that you're pointing out, and we'll get to in a bit, but I think that this is important to note, that is part of this phenomenon, is a crash in the immigrants' fertility rate after they immigrate that has increased recently, in the same way that we've seen like the Latin American fertility crashes. One of the big changes that we're seeing now in fertility statistics is that a lot of these like Muslim populations that we thought would stay high fertility are not staying high fertility. And I suspect that a huge part of the problem for them is just not enough women, because they really have to marry within their culture. But they don't have to, but it's much harder to marry.
And you have to think about now the interesting dating dynamics of immigrant populations in the West, because a lot of these minority populations were like overwhelmingly one gender, which means that they can't marry within the group. So if, for example, the Pakistani in Italy is 70% male, then most of those men are going to have to date outside of their own group or else be lonely forever. And then you entered in like the international dating market. And I concluded that, even we like to be concerned about Western men having it hard on the dating market. Imagine how difficult it is for Arab and Indian men in the West.
Oh, yeah.
When there is a massive abundance of men on the dating market, and most women prefer the Western European man.
Yeah, well, this is also something to note in cross-ethnic dating, is that there's typically gender preferences. So typically, like East Asian women perform disproportionately better when compared to East Asian men, who perform pretty poorly. And it's the same with Black men sometimes perform. Actually, no, they don't. Now that I remember the statistics, it's more of a stereotype. I know that white men perform unusually good across reply rates. Like if you look at OkCupid data and stuff like that. So yeah, you're absolutely right. That would absolutely suck.
Yeah. So what I've concluded is that even if a minority population has a fertility rate of, let's say, 2.1, if 70% of that population is men and only 30% of them are women, that population will still decline because those women will not be able to birth enough babies to replace all of those men.
Yeah.
Well, no, the 2.1 fertility rate would take into account the gender imbalance.
No.
So is the 2.1 tied to women specifically? I think it's tied to the entire population.
It's looking at the women. So it's
Is that the way
looking
it's
at
calculated?
Yeah. So it's calculating at the number of women, and usually, okay, they have to have 2.1.
So it appears he's right when the data is recorded correctly, but it's hard to pin this down because it appears that some people don't always calculate the data this way, even though they should be calculating the data this way, which is fascinating and can make TFR a much harder number to use to get predictions than I expected originally.
So when you think about these gender imbalances, that, okay, let's say that the Thai immigration, which is, let's say, 80% women, for them to replace all of the Thai women and all of the men, you don't need a fertility rate of 2.1 among them. They can actually increase the number, although as half Asian in most cases, if even with a lower fertility rate. So when you take into account these vast gender imbalances in various immigration groups, you realize that the female migration into Western world is going to have a long-term bigger effect on the demographics than the male surplus, because the male surplus is just going to compete in a dating market that is benefiting fewer and fewer men. And since there's such abundance of men, that means that most men are going to lose that competition. Unfortunately, that's something I'm not taking joy in this. I'm deeply sympathetic to men who are just going to lose out on this through no fault of their own.
Well, that's why you need grooming gangs. You're not going to get one any other way. This is what's going on there. Well, no, I mean, if you, and this is something also to remember. Okay, so suppose you have two cultures living next to each other, and this is why I think grooming gangs is such a common phenomenon. If one of the culture, the immigrant group, is overwhelmingly male, and they come from a culture where men marry at a much younger age than they do within our culture, if they are courting women, even totally above board, and their culture treats women as essentially house slaves, and their culture doesn't really let women make many decisions, even if they're doing everything above board from their own cultural perspective, it would appear from our cultural perspective to be a grooming gang, because they would be targeting it, because they do marry at a younger age in these countries. They would be appearing to treat these women as slaves afterwards, but that's normal in their country. And they would appear to not let their women go outside much and stuff after that, but that's normal in their country. So
they rear them towards subservience.
Yeah,
exactly right.
That's an interesting emergent phenomenon of overly gendered immigration from cultures that are dramatically different from our own. Can you share the Italian chart, by the way? I don't think we got to that, and the UK one.
Yeah, it's up right now. Oh wait, it's the UK.
This is the UK.
That's the UK. So you can see here that the interesting thing about the UK is that since it's lost almost all of its industry and a lot of its economy is focusing on education, it's caused the majority of all immigration into the UK to be women.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
And that means that most of the immigration from Europe to the UK is women, because they come there to study. But when you look at outside of Europe, outside of the Western world, it's basically the same trends with Middle East, Indian subcontinent, North Africa,
and China.
male.
Just China over and over again. This has got to be murdering them.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. This is not good for China at all. More women are immigrating out of China than the men, right? So
whatever women remain. This is crazy.
Yeah.
Well, let's look at Italy.
We can right there see the number of countries was very limited. So, but it still shows the same trends, with an exception to Iran, which was fairly close to 50-50.
I think that the Russia and Ukrainian situation is going to be way more impactful to their own populations than a lot of people realize right now. I think we're talking about almost ethnic cleansing levels of depopulation in some of these areas.
So Western Europe receiving a bit of a demographic boost from the war in Ukraine, because you have all these women leaving Ukraine, and a lot of them will not return back home once there's peace again.
Well, and also Russia. So I watch a number of Russian YouTube channels, and given that women are more left leaning and are more influenced by the urban monoculture, a lot of women, whether these are good women to marry or not, were sort of scared out of the country, is one of the things I've seen with the war because of the online conversation around the war that made them feel uncomfortable staying.
Yeah, a lot of the anti-war dissidents in Russia, there were a few million of them. They just left in the first year and two of the war.
Yeah.
So there was a significant depopulation, and a lot of them were women. And I don't think they'll be returning back to Russia. So that means that, yeah, it's just a really serious demographic decline. It's not going to be sufficient for a lot of countries to have just 2.1 children per woman. Some of these countries are going to need a little bit higher than that, which is just makes the whole solution and, the situation even worse. It makes
the
it
argument
way
that
more
Malcolm makes again and again is it's much worse than that, because still in many of these developed countries, a huge portion of the population plans on having zero. So there's even more overcorrection that has to be made.
So
You need
but
to
the point
have
he's
8.
making, Simone, is look at like Latin America, where we're
Mhm.
seeing crashing fertility rates right now. This
Right.
is where they're going to deal with the biggest issue here.
Mhm.
Latin America is also losing tons of its population. So
Yes.
the state takes the time and the expense to educate these people during the period when they're net parasitic on society, their young age, and then they move to the United States when they become producers, and never move back. At the same time, these countries, many of them have a lower fertility rate than the United States. I need to run the math on this, but I think right now about half of Latin America has a fertility rate that's lower than the United States, and it will soon, within at least the next 10 years.
Yeah.
With this being the case, the fact that they are also losing population is going to drain them so quickly from an economic perspective.
Right. So when you really take these different factors into play, you realize that the demographic future of the Western world is looking better than a lot of these other regions of the world. We do receive, even though we have a lot of disaffected young people, they have better conditions and better circumstances for a good future than a lot of these other areas. Even though these other areas might be growing and might be on the rise, I don't think that's going to be long lasting.
Well, I think we also need to consider the effects of immigration that is majority one gender from hard conservative cultures, because not a lot of progressive women are going to be interested in marrying into a strict Muslim household, for example.
Right.
Even though they signal that they would be, they like the moment they realize what's really up and they're like, oh, this is actually like conservative and not like play conservative, I think that they would say no to that. I'm also interested in the data you had on the collapsing fertility rates in second generation immigrants.
Right. So a lot of people are concerned that immigrants are becoming minority majority population in the Western countries, and there's a lot of data in Sweden that shows that the second generation of immigrants have a far lower birth rate than the native Swedish women do. So this is not showing in the regular TFR numbers. So it's a relative numbers compared to Swedish women.
Oh.
So at the top of this table, you have 1. That means that whatever number the Swedish women are having babies at.
Mm-hmm.
And if anything is showing above 1, that means that they're having more children than Swedish women. And if it is below 1, that means that they're having fewer children than Swedish women.
What is Model A versus Model B?
It's different ways of calculating this relativity. And I won't go into details of it, but there were different models that they were running with.
So this is really fascinating. It looks like the Middle East, like if you're looking at where their fertility rate is relative to Sweden, it looks like, okay, it's about the same as Swedish women, 0.96 or 1.02, depending on the model being used. But pretty much all of that seems to be coming from Turkish immigrants.
Yeah. So this is interesting that the Middle East category is mostly just 2 countries, Iran and Syria. Now, the thing about Syria is that half of those immigrants are Christians, not Muslims. So half of them are Muslims, half of them are Christian in Sweden. And so the Middle East category and Turkey are having about the same number of children as Swedish women do in the second generation. Yeah. But when you look at these other countries that are Muslim, like North Africa, like Iran, it is way lower.
It's shockingly low. It's like at 0.43, 0.6, it's around half.
And the most shocking one is Horn of Africa. That is Somalia, that is Eritrea, that is
Yeah.
Ethiopia. They're having about half as many children
Less than
as
half,
Swedish women.
0.43,
What on
0.49.
earth? Okay.
So that's something you usually don't ever see, that Africans are having collapsing birth rates compared to Europeans.
Yeah.
And this is what I'm going to go to a Swedish media studio tomorrow to talk about this and give people a white pill in the right wing. That if immigration were to stop to Sweden right now, and you just go forward 100 years, then the Swedish share of the population would increase, and the minority population would decrease as a proportion.
No, okay, I'm struggling with this. So it says that this graph was taken. I can understand if this was a recent shift, but it says this is between 1998 and 2012.
It looked at every single year, the birth rates of all of these different groups of every single year, and they averaged out.
Right. But what I'm saying is this must be unique to Sweden, because I've seen other charts that show immigrants having higher birth rates, at least within generation one of the native population.
Yeah. So generation one in Sweden shows higher fertility rates among immigrants. And that's why people get the conception that they are going to become a majority, because they only look at the first generations of fertility rates, which is easily available. You just look at who's foreign born, just look at their TFR, and then you just run a simulation on that, and then you make the conclusion, oh, they're becoming a majority in like a few generations from now. You have data on the second generation, those who grew up in Sweden with immigrant-born parents, and they don't have the same number of kids. So in Norway, they had this interesting data that showed that immigrants have the same TFR after about 10 or 15 years of living in Norway. And in Denmark, they have a bit lower. Even first-generation immigrants have a bit lower TFR than the native Danish women.
So my read of this would be that these groups maintain their culture for Gen 1, and because they're from a different cultural background, they're going to have more kids. But after Gen 1, they are much more susceptible to the urban monoculture because they haven't been as exposed to it. They haven't been forced for generations to send their kids to school systems meant to brainwash them. And so they actually get deconverted at a higher rate than kids from local, moderately conservative cultures would be my guess.
There's another valuable piece of data that you have to take into consideration, is that most immigration concentrated in the cities. And we know that cities, on average, have a lower number of children than the countryside.
That makes sense.
And the countryside is homogenous. So when you say that, okay, the immigrants have higher number of kids, then that would suggest that the cities should have higher birth rates than the countryside. But that's not the case. So if the first generation immigrants are having more kids, then what explains this massive, the significant lower number of kids that are born in the cities? And it's the second generation that is collapsing.
Yeah.
So this means that, it's not a permanent solution to have immigrants replace the native born, the locals,
Well, and one thing I'd point out here is the situation is actually worse than this in a way, which is to say that the immigrants whose fertility rate is collapsing are the ones that acculturate, and the ones who do not acculturate are the ones who keep a high fertility rate.
Yes. So if you just look at those numbers, the European countries that are most similar to Sweden have similar number of kids. And when you go further and further away from Sweden, it tends to get lower and lower. Yeah. And that's when you get, the most incompatible culture is from Horn of Africa, for example, or Afghanistan, and etc.
Well, I mean, I think what we're seeing here is which immigrant populations are most likely to actually replace, or not replace is the wrong word here, but I mean
integrate and adapt,
end up becoming a permanent, like the actual fear that people have, which is a different cultural group is going to have a higher fertility rate than us that we are importing. The only one that I see that from a European perspective people would actually be super afraid of would be Turkey, and who has a huge Turkish immigrant population is Germany. So as I said, Germany is cooked. So many things. Other than Germany, some of the other countries might be in a better position than we would have thought, which is really interesting.
Yeah. Encouraging.
Yeah. So it's not all just doom and gloom about the future of the West. The incels in the West have a better chance than incels in the rest of the world by a long shot.
Yeah, in a
make
sense,
note
they're
here.
shaping the future because they're the most likely also to pioneer a new post-globalization intergenerational culture that works, because they've been the first to encounter the fact that this current urban monoculture is deadly.
I'd also note what's really interesting about this to me is the groups that are intergeneration, you know, when they get to generation 2, maintaining a high fertility rate. If you're looking at Arab's the wrong word here with Persians, we hate being called Arab. I'd say like Middle Eastern countries. It's the countries that are actually the most urban monoculture in their vibe, and the ones that are most radically different actually seem to be able to preserve their culture the least well. You know, with like Iran having a terrible fertility rate and Turkey having a fairly good fertility rate. My guess is what's causing this is just exposure to the urban monoculture before this. Like,
Right.
how radically different was this for them?
You got to keep in mind that the Middle East has had the most radical transformation in the last century.
Yeah.
So the Middle East had a population of about 42 million in the year 1917. And in the year 2017, 100 years later, they had about 420 million. So their population increased by 1,000% in 100 years.
Yeah.
Jordan had, you know, just a few nomads at a few 100,000. And today they are over 10 million people.
Wow.
You know, they just built cities in the middle of the desert where there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. And then these nomads and these goat herders and all of that suddenly had to adapt to a new urban reality. And their culture is not very well suited for that.
Yeah. Well, and as you've pointed out in other stuff, we're going to see a massive collapse of water supplies. It may not be as bad as you think. Elon pointed this out, and I think he made really good argument on this, which he's like, if you look at the decreasing cost of desalination and you project it going forwards, it's actually been accelerating at a super fast pace. However, what I think Elon's getting wrong here is having desalination plants in these countries is going to require a sustained global economy. And if that begins to falter with the collapse of inevitable demographic collapse of Europe, then I don't think that I would expect these countries to maintain access to desalination plants, which will lead to massive outward immigration waves.
To give some context, I mentioned to the Collins that I believe that a large portion of the world population is going to run out of water in a couple of decades. And that is going to cause huge waves of immigration, probably to the West and other areas that are more sustainable.
Yeah.
And that's largely going to come from the Middle East and North Africa that relies on aquifers and desalination plants to get their water. They don't have rain. They don't have a whole lot of rivers. They don't have a lot of freshwater lakes to get water from. So their water is mostly aquifers, and that's finite, depleting at a very fast rate.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, it's not just those countries. If you're looking at the Americas, for example, you have two major problems coming up. One is Peru. And many people are like, oh, Peru, what a lovely place with like jungle. No, Peru's mostly a desert.
Yes.
And the biggest city in Peru, Lima, which is like a mega city, it's the same way that like Seoul is like a third of or 2/3 of South Korea's population. It's just like a huge chunk of the country's population. I can't remember, but it's more than that. Is completely dependent on a water supply in the mountains, which is going to be gone in the next, I think, 15 years or something, or 20 years.
Oh,
so
God.
That is, Lima is cooked, Simone. That's why I want to get. We're trying to sell a house there right now.
And California is cooked as well. Their agriculture is, you know, really running out of water.
Yeah.
So,
And they're draining the Ogallala aquifer, which is.
But the thing about that is that
terrifying.
that's not going to cause a big food threat to the American citizens. That's just going to remove all the food exports that the U.S. is doing. So it's going to primarily impact the third world that the U.S. exports food to.
Well, we're sort of preparing the world for that. Hello, tariffs. I feel like they're the, you know, let's get ready for the future before we're forced to.
So whenever people think about natural resources, they always get fixated on the very specific stuff like lithium or oil, and they tend to ignore the essentials like water, wood, sand, and things like that the West, including Europe, has huge numbers of.
Well, I guess that was China. China is so bad with its food. Like it not only imports tons of food, it even has to import its oh god, what is that called again? The nitrates. It even has to import its nitrates,
Yeah.
which means that if trade networks broke down, China would be really effed by them. And the United States is in a remarkably good position if any sort of deglobalization happens, because we can easily feed ourselves, and very few other parts of the world can both manage their own energy needs and their own food needs.
Right. And, when you look at what countries export the most food, it's all these European countries.
Mhm.
They're not the top producers of food, but when it comes to export, the exporting market, that's when all the European countries reach to the top, like Australia, USA, Russia, Argentina, France. And if those countries were to suddenly have a food crisis, they're going to prioritize their own citizens. If they have an economic decline, they're going to prioritize the needs and the safety of their own citizens and have to sacrifice their export markets. So it's in the best interest for people living in the third world that the West is doing okay. There is no, we have such an interconnected world that there is no local or national collapse. Like if one country goes, it creates a chain reaction that affects everyone else. When the US economy sneezes, the rest of the world gets a cold. And I think it's not just the US, but like smaller countries can have that chain reaction effect as well. Just to make a very fast summary, there is a huge amount of marriage migration going on into the West, and it's causing the migration into the Western countries to be fairly gender balanced, more so than people believe. That's coming from Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and Latin America for the most part. And that's driven by, 4 factors: gender-segregated economy, political divide between men and women. It's caused by us natural male surplus being born all the time and no wars to kill them off. And it's also caused by just women preferring to date the same men, a small group of men, rather than settle for an average guy. So these urban women, they, instead of causing mass male migration, they resort to polygamy.
Yeah.
And this male surplus in the countryside, instead of sharing wives, they import wives. So even if a country has 50-50 gender balance, you can still have a massive shortage of single women that average men can date. And in that sense, the Western world is in a better position. Incels here in a better position than the incels in the third world.
Well, and culturally, these women are going to convert much more than the men. As you said, it's because they have a private. But ethnically, if you're looking at how these countries are going to change, what we're going to see is a shift, because women have kids. Female immigrants have kids. Male immigrants can't really have kids.
Unless they find a woman, but that's becoming harder and harder to do.
So what we will see is a shift to become more Russian, more East Asian, more Latin American.
Yeah. So the culture will be relatively unchanged. The crime levels won't be affected a whole lot by that. But the genetic impact is going to be significant. And that is a discussion.
But I don't think for most people who care about this stuff, concerning.
Yeah. It's just going to be different.
Yeah, in the US, not so much. But in Europe, there is more blood and soil vibe to the whole continent, that there is they're not going to oppose it, but they're going to be concerned about that and be a little anxious. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
But they don't talk about it publicly. They don't fight for it. They're like, I'm going to be anxious privately while we die out. I'm like, okay, great. Be anxious privately while you die out.
Be anxious while you marry a Thai woman.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But I don't think any of the like gene bros would care about that. Like they all want to marry Thai women. Who doesn't want to marry a Thai woman?
Actions speak louder than words. I don't know. Yeah.
Hold on. There's a reason why.
Too, but I see the appeal.
I mean, if you think about lineage, a half Asian guy is going to have worse odds at finding a partner in the West than a fully European guy.
True.
So,
but here's the thing: they make great women. They're so.
I don't know.
good at
I feel
making
like
women Simone, they're
mixed
so good at making
men
women
and women are
that some
gorgeous.
of their guys look like women. That is,
Yeah, but
that
a lot
is,
of women are into that. They're into that. No,
no,
like,
no,
look at
they're not. Not really. This is why one of my favorite things. I was talking to someone once about like a trans person, and I was like, "Do they pass?" And they go, "They pass like a Thai person." And I was like, "Oh, damn, they must pass really well."
Yeah.
Oh
God.
all right.
That's top tier. All right, have a good one.
This has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on.
I cackle with glee at their self-centered ways. No children to carry their fleeting sad days. They spit on the past, dodge the debts they should pay, while I sow the future to wipe them away. Behold my grand scheme, my vitalist might. I'll flood their dead cities with life's boundless fight. Their venomous culture, all pleasure and lies, leaves them broken, despairing, with howls to the skies. They crave shallow thrills, chasing claps from the crowd, but their toxic obsession just builds them a shroud. Depression and dread twist their minds in a haze. Their selfish betrayal fuels their miserable days. Behold my grand scheme, my vitalist might. I'll flood their dead cities with life's boundless fight. Their venomous culture, all pleasure and lies, leaves them broken, despairing, with howls to the skies. They crave shallow thrills, chasing claps from the crowd, but their toxic obsession just builds them a shroud. Depression and dread twist their minds in a haze. Their selfish betrayal fuels their miserable days. Behold my grand scheme, my vitalist might. I'll flood their dead cities with life's boundless fight. Their venomous culture, all pleasure and lies, leaves them broken, despairing, with howls to the skies. My heirs will march forth where their weakness collapses. Their legacy's dust from their own selfish lapses. They squandered their souls for a fleeting vain spark. Now their screams pierce the void of their self-inflicted dark. Behold my grand scheme, my vitalist might. I'll flood their dead cities with life's boundless fight. Their venomous culture, all pleasure and lies, leaves them broken, despairing, with howls to the skies. So fall, you narcissists, in your self-crafted doom. Your culture's a toxin that choked out your bloom. My vitalist banner will soar your cries, reclaiming tomorrow with life that won't die.